I'm David Grosso, and I was an at-large council member in the District of Columbia for 8 years. I served 2 terms. I was the chair of the Committee on Education for 6 of those 8 years, served on a bunch of other committees. The District of Columbia got home rule in the early 1970s, and when home rule was set up, they established a government that included the DC Council. So what is the DC Council? The DC Council is a body of 13 members. It includes 8 ward members, so the city is broken into 8 different parts, and each one of those parts has about 80,000 residents, where there is somebody who represents those 80,000 people. In addition to that, there are 4 at-large council members, which are elected citywide, and they are people that are more engaged in the higher policy issues, whereas the ward members tend to do a lot more constituent services work. District of Columbia is similar to other places where they elect members on a particular schedule. And so there's only 2 at-large members elected at the same time. And so every 2 years there's an election. So you have 4-year terms, so it overlaps. And so there are 4 ward members that are elected at the same time as 2 at-large members. And then there's 2 years later, you'll have 4 other ward members, 2 other at-large members. The chairperson and the mayor are all elected in that same time, and the Attorney General as well. The chairperson of the council has an incredibly important role, mostly because of the power that they have. This person sets the agenda, they establish the committees, they appoint council members to the committees. They are the ones that run the whole show. They also have the power to staff the council, so the general counsel's office, the budget office, the secretary's office, all the administrative work that has to happen is done by the chairperson and their staff. So the chairperson controls the local budget, understanding who gets paid what, all of that across the entire council. So it's a pretty big deal. It's just one of those things where I don't think the public fully realizes just how powerful the chairperson is. So every 2 years at the DC Council, we have a new council period, which means that new legislation has to be introduced. Old legislation expires and you start over again. And the chairperson is the one every 2 years that then sets up the committees, assigns council members to be chair people of those committees, and then assigns council members to those committees and can move it all around. The mayor of the District of Columbia is the most powerful political position in the District of Columbia. So the mayor has the responsibility to do oversight of all of the agencies and all of the executive functions, which means that she has to hire directors of agencies, she has to oversee what they're doing, she has to help manage and create a budget every single year, and that budget then gets submitted to the DC Council for their review. The mayor of the District of Columbia is like a governor as well as a mayor. So if you think about all the functions that a state would have, the District of Columbia has to endure that as well. And so normally the state might be the ones that have the state education office, for example, and the state education office would be at the state level, and then all the local cities around the state would have their own education systems, and they would hire and fire their chancellors or their superintendents and et cetera. In the District of Columbia, that's not likely because we don't have statehood yet, right? The Congress has denied us this. And so the mayor has to play the functions of a governor, of a mayor, even of a county supervisor. I mean, it's really all in one. So her job is a really big job, and it includes a lot of, direction building. So like making policies on economic development, on housing, on education, on healthcare, all those things fall under her purview. The way that it's set up, though, in the District of Columbia, at least traditionally, it could change. But right now, there are deputy mayors within certain areas of governance. So there's a deputy mayor for education. There's a deputy mayor for justice, which is the one that does all the police work. There's a deputy mayor for health and human services. There's a city administrator that does all the kind of operations of the city. It is a top-heavy government right now where the mayor is very insulated. And so if you want to make change in the city, one of the things you have to do is get to know these deputy mayors, get to know their staffs, and work with them as well. So the mayor, when it comes to legislative work in the District of Columbia, is limited in her role recommendations of policies, essentially. So if the mayor would like to introduce legislation, she has to submit it to the chairperson of the council, and the chairperson of the council then introduces it on the mayor's behalf. And so this is something that is not it's not like something that doesn't happen on a regular basis in other jurisdictions. But then she has to step back, and then she's requested to testify maybe at the hearing. She writes a letter of support or disagreement, and then in the end, she can veto the legislation if she doesn't support it. Obviously, the council can override the veto. I don't think that's ever happened where the mayor's vetoed something and it hasn't been overridden by the council. How does the mayor interact with the council on justice policy? The mayor of the District of Columbia is the final stop, right? So when you have a police department, or you have, the DYRS, the Department of Youth Rehabilitative Services, where youth are incarcerated, where you have, the fact is that the mayor is the one that actually manages all of that work, not the council. So you think about the council as policy making and the mayor as implementation of the policy. So a good example of this is, so the mayor has a deputy mayor for, I don't know what justice, and I don't know what it's called right now, but it's a deputy mayor on all these issues. And the deputy mayor is the one that oversees all of the different agencies, like the ONE's office, the Office of Neighborhood Services and Engagement Services, the Office of Victim Services and Grants, all those agencies that are under the Justice Department, the mayor has control over. And then the council can hold hearings. There's a committee in the council, the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety, which has hearings on all of the mayor's nominees. When the District of Columbia got home rule in the early 1970s, there was a movement in the country to create more localized representation in the different bodies, legislative bodies. And this was considered to be something kind of new. And so Congress was exploring it, the District of Columbia was exploring it, and Congress thought it would be better if they had individual sections of the city of small numbers of residents represented locally that could then report up to the council or report out on certain issues that are important to them. So an advisory neighborhood commission is a group of elected representatives that represent what are called single member districts. A single member district is the entire city divided up into small little districts that only have 2,000 people in each district. And so whereas a ward council member represents around 80,000 people, an ANC member in their single member district represents only 2,000 people. Now what they do is they have the ability to hold meetings, to review zoning, review licenses for establishments in their community, to weigh in on trash pickup, on signage, on street changes, on all the little things that are so important to make up a community. And so an advisory neighborhood commission has what's called great weight. Great weight means that when they opine, now they have to vote on it and they have to do it as a body. So the small group of advisory neighborhood commissioners in a particular area are together in their ANC and they get to vote on things. And so they can oppose a restaurant coming in, or they could support a restaurant coming in. They could oppose a major development project. But when they do, whether it's before the Deputy Mayor for Economic Development or the Alcohol Beverage Administration, they get what's called great weight because they have to be given greater consideration than just an individual resident who comes in and opines. And that's what advisory neighborhood commissioners are. This is something where, you've seen it in the past where advisory neighborhood commissions were heavily engaged in what they called nuisances, right? So when you think about justice issues, you think about what happens on the street and, can this person walk along and sell what they want to sell on the street, whatever it may be. In the past, that was a major contention between people that lived there and the people that were engaging in some commercial activities along the sidewalk. That caused major battles, and you got things that were like things like prostitution-free zones, right? Where they would be higher penalties in particular neighborhoods if people were to go there and engage in commercial sex work. This is something that advisory neighborhood commissioners had a big role to play in, right? So they were the ones that complained. They were the ones that went to the MPD, they went to the city council, and they got these things implemented. So they could also be on the other side of that, right? When we're talking about decriminalizing sex work to try to make it a more friendly city for people to get the help and support that they need, the advisory neighborhood commissioners were some of the first people we went to. And we said, look, wouldn't it be better if you had a good and honest relationship with the people working in your neighborhood so that when they're littering or when they're doing public displays of sex, you could actually go up and talk to them and say, please don't do that in my neighborhood, rather than getting them arrested and thrown in jail for something that maybe, the city could do a better job supporting on. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton is the delegate. She is a woman that was elected, oh my gosh, it must be 30-some years ago now, is our representative in Congress. And, this is something that we fought really hard to get. Most of the different kind of areas in our country that are not considered states, like Guam, Puerto Rico, and other places, have what are called non-voting delegates. And they have an office in Congress. They're allowed to engage in committee work. They're allowed to engage in debates. They get a staff. They do constituent work. But they aren't allowed to vote in the House of Congress. And so they can sometimes, when the Democrats are in control, they can vote in committees. When the Republicans are in control, they can't. Things of that nature happen. Congresswoman Norton, she's been there a long time, so she's moved up in power. So she has more power than most of the delegates. She has her own committee. She's very high up in the transportation committee. She has work on government kind of security issues. So that's an important committee she sits on. And then she has to do, just by nature, all things DC. And so she is up there fighting for us every single day, trying to fend off negative things like we've seen recently, or trying to get positive things through Congress on our behalf. So every year when our budget goes up there, we also have all of our legislation, once it's passed at the council, has to go to Congress for final approval. It's a passive approval for the most part, and historically hasn't been too contentious, but lately, as you follow in the news, they undercut our criminal code reform efforts. They're trying to undercut our police reform efforts. Just the other day, they had a hearing on local elections in DC and whether or not we should reform them. So she spends a lot of her time going over to offices, meeting with folks. I was her chief counsel for 2 years. Spent a lot of time in meetings, trying to engage, and trying to elevate the District of Columbia as a relevant body. We pay more per capita in taxes than most other states. We, fight in wars. We do, what we need to do to support this country on a daily basis by supporting the federal government, and yet we have no vote in Congress. It's interesting. Even when the Democrats were last in control, Congresswoman Norton had a vote on the floor of the House on bills, but there was a caveat. It was only a vote if she didn't break a tie. So, what good is that vote? The Attorney General came into existence just a few years ago in the District of Columbia. We didn't have an elected Attorney General. What we had was the Corporation Council. And so what happened, it was kind of a political move, to be honest. It was something about getting another high-level elected official in the District of Columbia so we could keep pushing for greater democracy in the city, like statehood, to also act like a state. They have elected attorney generals, etc. The challenge with the Attorney General's office is that their powers are very limited. Under Attorney General Carl Racine, who was the first elected Attorney General, he had a lot of dreams about what he could do, but didn't get a whole lot done in those areas because he cannot do any prosecution or any kind of investigation into adult crimes. And so it's really limited in that respect. Like I told you before, in revitalization, the federal government took over our court system. And so they closed Lorton, which was a major prison in Virginia that all of our residents would go to. Now our residents, when they're sentenced, go off to the Bureau of Prisons, and they're done through the courts in D.C. Superior Court judges are nominated by the President of the United States and appointed by them. And so go through Congress for approval. This is the biggest challenge we have to statehood, is that an entire branch of our government is not under our control. And so when you have the Attorney General, they can do things like, and they do a great job at, consumer protection. They do all youth crimes, right? So they determine whether to paper or no paper on youth crimes, which is interesting and certainly something that's very justice involved around whether or not we're going to do more restorative practices and try to get youth more engaged and away from the practices that got them in trouble. They do a lot of that work. They do a lot of violence interruption work, which is more policy work. So they're on the streets with violence interrupters that they fund and support. A lot of it is like the old school diversion work is now being transformed in a more proactive prevention work, which is really valuable and comes out of the Office of the Attorney General. Now, they have a policy shop too. So they can also recommend legislation. They can opine on legislation. They can't put legislation forward, but the chairperson of the council can introduce legislation on their behalf. How do council members negotiate and compromise and work through legislation together? It starts with the staff, to be honest with you. We might have, here's a good example. Just better to tell you to an example. The Universal Paid Leave Act. It was legislation that myself and Councilmember Alyssa Silverman, who used to be on the council with me, envisioned. We introduced legislation in the model that we thought would be best. And we went out and met with a bunch of constituents on it and got this legislation to the council. Chairman Mendelson and others were reticent, not ready to do it, right? So how did you figure out how to get them to agree to sign on to this legislation? It took us 2 years of actually having good hearings, having advocacy groups come in and meet with my colleagues to get them to understand it and fully educate them, and then get to the point where we could sit down and negotiate. So it happens often, at a hearing, but more often behind the scenes. It's something that is on the phone, in an office. I was pretty well known for just sitting in the, kind of waiting area for Chairman Mendelson to meet with him. He didn't have time, so I would make the time to just sit there and wait until he came out, and then we'd meet. And he was always good about meeting. And then what you do is you have to have your asks and you have to have your knowledge of what you're getting at. And that's key. So when you go in there, you have to be able to negotiate. A good example of some kind of reforms that have come from groups or individuals in the community to the council. The one that comes to mind first and foremost is the Fair Access to School Act. The Fair Access to School Act was legislation that I moved that stopped the suspension and expulsions of students between pre-K and 8th grade and severely limited it in high school and created that they had to do plans. This legislation came out of conversations with groups like the Black Swan Academy, students at Thurgood Marshall Academy, the ACLU doing a lot of their research and writing, their policy team talking about disparate treatment with suspensions and how Black students were way more likely to be suspended than white students. And all of that came to a head in our hearings. We started having hearings on discipline and schools, and these groups were ready, and they came in and met with me. They talked about the experiences the Black Swan Academy brought their students to meet with me and talked about how they get, picked on or suspended based on a uniform violation, or the way that your hair is done, or the way that you're talking to a teacher or a principal. And we started studying this in my office and started really seeing that what they were saying was not just true, but having a huge impact on the quality of education for these students. And so the kind of the mission of the committee when I ran the committee was to put every student in the best position to succeed. And not to tell the teachers how to teach or the principals how to run their school, but to make sure that when a student showed up to school, she was in the best position to succeed. So whatever that meant, right? And so what that did mean primarily for me was when she did show up from school, don't kick her out. I mean, honestly, there were so many cases where a student would show up late to school and they would suspend her. And it just didn't make any sense to me. But I didn't know about those stories, but for the fact that we had students and advocates coming to my office and asking me to make this change. And then they brought me real stories, real issues, and invited me out to the community where I went out and met with folks and learned about it. And, now I have story after story I can tell about how negative it was and how we've transformed this. And what's come of this now, which is the most beautiful thing, is that, the teachers legitimately said to us as we were pushing for reforms, right? The first thing I did was ban suspension and expulsion of 3 and 4-year-olds, because we knew when we studied it that there were 170 pre-K students suspended from school. Now, None of these students did anything that was so crazy that they needed to be suspended, but they were suspended. So we banned that. Then the teachers started really getting upset. So we had to then bring the teachers together with the students that were advocating for this and have a real discussion on what was needed. And what did we learn? We learned that what students and teachers both wanted were more mental health supports in schools. They wanted to have a school-based mental health system created that would give an opportunity for restorative circles and restorative practices. So we created a trauma-informed fund, we created restorative practices fund, and we created a school-based mental health program that now has 2 professionals in every single school in the district, both charter and traditional schools, for school-based mental health. None of that would have happened if it weren't for the organizations and individuals that came to us and said there's an inequity in the way that students are being pushed out of school. And now the District of Columbia is at the forefront of trying to change the way that we do discipline and trying to give every student that opportunity to succeed. And it's a remarkable shift. The criminal justice reform, I think, in the District of Columbia right now is at one of the lower points, to be honest. I think that we were making some really good progress. I think that unfortunately there's been an uptick in violence that has made people nervous in the city, and for legit reasons, right? There was a bystander shot the other day outside of Howard Theater, at a fight that happened. And, the challenge we have here is that when people get scared, like I think they genuinely are, they revert to flight or fight mode. They don't use their brains the way that they should be using them. And they say stupid things like, more time in jail is going to make a difference when it comes to crime prevention. When in fact, we know from lots of studies that when somebody is punished immediately, it doesn't matter how severe the punishment is. As long as you catch them quickly and punish them immediately, you could do a day in jail and it would have the same impact as 10 years in jail to prevent that crime in the future. So what we saw in DC, I think, was a movement after George Floyd. And the city council, to our credit, was doing a lot of work before that on police reform, on trying to embrace nonviolent strategies, right? Violence interrupters were being funded. We were doing all that. But then George Floyd was murdered, and we saw how that impacted the world, and it impacted DC. And we started doing some police reform efforts around that, mostly because of the protests and the way that the police interacted with the protesters. But it was also because there was some underlying accountability measures that needed to be done. That work, and one of the parts that I worked on was trying to get MPD out of schools. We have what are school resource officers, and we were trying to get them out of schools. The year after I left office, Councilmember Allen did that, and you saw this year the council reversed that. So it's an interesting example, right? So when there's fear in the air, people tend to revert back to the old way of doing things, which is a law and order approach where more police are better. And, I've always been, I'm somebody who called for police not to be armed in DC. I believe that MPD shouldn't have guns because I think it creates a more equal environment and you could do better community policing then. So when I walk up to a police officer and want to engage in a conversation, I want it to be as equal as possible so that they understand that their power is that they have access to government resources and can help me resolve the issues I'm dealing with, not just that they can pull a gun out and shoot me. So this is a challenge I think we have not evolved in the city leadership especially, to the point where those types of reforms are sustainable and can actually be implemented for the long haul. Now, it was a big step, I think, the Criminal Code Reform Commission and the work that was done over more than 6 years of research and studies and meetings. That was something that I thought got really a disrespectful response from the mayor that resulted in the Congress's action and the president's actions. And, could that have made a difference? I think it would make a huge difference. And I honestly did not think it went far enough. I think we need to decriminalize a whole lot more in the District of Columbia to actually lift people up and have them be successful. And the example I give, is, when I was a kid growing up in DC, I was a teenager in DC, I'd work at the bars all day long, all night long until like 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. And I'd come home from the bar, and I lived in Petworth, right on Rockery Church Road. And this was, in the mid to late 80s. And I'd park my car wherever, I was 17, 18 years old. I'd usually been drinking. I usually had some kind of drug in my pocket. I was a mess, right? And so I'd come out of my car and I'd walk right by the police who had young black residents lined up along the wall there, right at border and Rockaway Church Road, frisking them all. And then what would the police do? They just wave and say, "Hey, good evening, how you doing?" And never touched me. And why didn't they ever ask me a question? Because I was a white kid walking through the neighborhood and I wasn't black. I don't think our criminal reforms, our justice reforms, are going to take hold and be sustainable until we actually get change. The main message that I have for people that have a passion, have something that they want to see changed, something that they would like to see done differently in this city, is that, get organized. It's really important. And, I think there's two different levels of organization. There's self-organization for sure. Like, don't just complain. Think about it. Think about a solution to your policy question. Don't go in with just questions, but have an answer too. Put your neck out a little. Come up with a broad, kind of brazen answer to something. Think outside the box. And then the other organizational level is bring your friends with you. It's really important to show up as a unified voice. And so it's one of the hardest things to do in advocacy is coalition building, because everyone has their idea and all their perspectives. And so you have to think of a mission, a policy ask that everyone can unify around. The more unified you are in that effort, so more organized and therefore unified you are in that effort, the more effective you will be. And then, the last thing I have to say is just, go out there and vote. If you don't like the way a council member is working on something, or you don't like the way the mayor's doing something, don't just assume that person is going to be there forever. I ran against an incumbent. I had never run before in my entire life, and I won. And, I think other people can do that. It's not that hard. You just have to go out and knock on doors, talk to people, engage with people genuinely, and do it for the right reasons. And you too can try your hand at trying to lead in this city. But don't assume that just because somebody's been there a long time that they deserve to be there tomorrow. Hold them accountable. And the way you hold people accountable in a democracy is voting, getting involved in elections.